Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The day had been long, the kind of grind that left every part of me aching for the comfort of home. My usual route back was a tedious stretch of sidewalks and intersections, always the same. That's why, when I noticed the newly opened shortcut, a narrow side street cutting between rows of vacant lots and abandoned buildings, I hesitated. It looked harmless enough. The streetlights cast dim pools of light, and the path was mostly clear, though overgrown bushes leaned in from the sides. It promised to shave several minutes off my trip, and the thought of getting home faster was irresistible. Still, something about the street gave me pause. It was too quiet. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, even oppressive. Shaking off the unease, I stepped onto the path, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a shortcut. At first, everything seemed fine. The sound of my footsteps echoed faintly, and the faint rustle of leaves broke the silence. But the further I went, the more the street seemed to close in around me. The lights ahead flickered sporadically, and shadows stretched long across the cracked asphalt. My pace quickened, driven by a vague but growing unease. I was about halfway down the shortcut when I heard it, a muffled voice, followed by a sharp thud. I froze, the sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. Peering ahead, I spotted them. Two men standing over someone who was hunched against a wall, their voices low and aggressive. The victim, a middle-aged man in a jacket too thin for the cold, clutched a bag to his chest as one of the men barked orders at him. The other robber grabbed the man's arm, yanking it roughly, sending the bag tumbling to the ground. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the spot as I watched, my mind racing with indecision. Should I call for help? Intervene? Before I could make a choice, one of the robbers turned his head sharply, his eyes locking onto mine. A chill ran through me as his expression twisted into something cold and predatory. He said something to his partner, and both men turned toward me. My heart lurched. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back the way I came. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the narrow street, the sound of my pounding footsteps blending with the sharp calls of the men behind me. "Hey! Stop!" one of them shouted, his voice harsh and commanding. I didn't dare look back. The shortcut felt longer now, the path twisting and turning in ways I hadn't noticed before. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, desperate to put distance between me and them. The echo of their footsteps remained close, unrelenting. I finally burst onto the main road, the familiar streetlights and occasional passing cars a jarring contrast to the suffocating darkness I'd just left. My house wasn't far now. I ran faster, every nerve in my body urging me forward. I reached my front door and fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. Finally, I shoved the key into the lock, twisted it, and threw the door open. Slamming it shut behind me, I locked the deadbolt and leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. But the relief was short-lived. A shadow moved past the front window, and then came the sound of muffled voices just outside. The men were there. I could hear them muttering, their words indistinct, but their presence unmistakable. My heart raced as I crept toward the window, peeking out from behind the curtain. One of them was at the front door, jiggling the handle. The other circled the house, his shadow flitting past the side windows. Panic surged. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The dispatcher's calm tone did little to soothe me. "Officers are on their way. Stay inside and keep the doors locked," she said. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and hung up. The minutes dragged on like hours. The robbers grew bolder, pounding on the door and testing the windows. "We know you're in there," one of them yelled, his voice filled with menace. I clutched a heavy object, a lamp from the side table, and positioned myself behind the couch, every instinct screaming at me to hide. One of the men tried prying open a window, the sound of metal scraping against wood setting my teeth on edge. The house felt fragile, like they could break in at any moment. I gripped the lamp tighter, sweat dripping down my forehead as I waited for either the sound of glass shattering or the arrival of help. The pounding on the door grew louder, each thud reverberating through the house like a drumbeat of dread. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. The man at the front door cursed loudly, frustration seeping into his voice. "Open up, or we'll make you regret it," he shouted, his words dripping with menace. From the corner of my eye, I saw the second man at a side window, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. He tried prying at the window with something metallic, muttering angrily when it refused to budge. My stomach churned as I realized they were determined to get in, no matter the effort. I clutched the lamp tighter, my fingers trembling. What would I do if they managed to break through? The thought of facing them alone, cornered, was almost too much to bear. My breath came in shallow gasps as I silently begged the sirens to arrive, the dispatcher's assurance of officers en route now feeling like a lifetime ago. A loud crash jolted me, my heart leaping into my throat. One of them had thrown something heavy at the front window, a muffled crack suggesting the glass had held, barely. They were shouting now, their words blending into a chaotic roar as my fear reached a boiling point. And then, finally I heard it, a faint but unmistakable sound that sent a wave of relief washing over me. Sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder, their wailing cry slicing through the tension like a knife. The robbers froze, their movements halting as the noise drew closer. "Cops!" one of them hissed, his voice a sharp whisper. They exchanged hurried words I couldn't make out before bolting, their footsteps fading into the darkness. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the approaching sirens. I didn't move, afraid to believe it was over until I saw the flashing red and blue lights wash over the front of the house. 2 squad cars screeched to a stop, and uniformed officers spilled out, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. One of them approached the front door cautiously, knocking firmly. "Police! Are you all right in there?" Relief crashed over me like a wave. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. The officer nodded, stepping inside as his partner began checking the perimeter. The police swept the area, their flashlights darting across yards and alleys as they searched for any sign of the men. "They're long gone," one of the officers said grimly, returning to the house. "But we'll keep a patrol car in the area tonight, just in case." I sat on the couch, my nerves frayed and my body trembling with residual adrenaline. The officers asked me to recount everything. The shortcut, the robbery, the chase, the attempted break-in. My words tumbled out in fragments, my hands shaking as I gestured toward the window they had tried to break. "You're lucky they didn't get inside," the officer said, his tone a mix of concern and relief. "They were desperate, and desperate people are unpredictable." I nodded, but the words did little to comfort me. The house still felt unsafe, the shadows outside still threatening. As the officers left, promising to follow up the next day, I double-checked every lock and bolted the door shut behind them. I had been looking for months. My budget was modest, but the housing market was unforgiving. That's why when I found the listing, it felt like a godsend. A spacious 2-story house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, priced well below anything comparable. The realtor explained it away, motivated seller, a little work needed, but I didn't question it. It was mine within weeks. The day I moved in, I couldn't shake the feeling of strangeness. The air inside the house was cool despite the summer heat, and every step I took echoed in an almost hollow way. There were signs of the previous owner everywhere, a mismatched chair left in the corner of the dining room, faded curtains that barely held onto their rods, and an attic filled with forgotten junk. Nothing unusual, I told myself. People leave things behind all the time. Still, that first night, as I lay on a mattress in an otherwise empty bedroom, I felt it. Not quite fear, but discomfort. Like the house was watching me as much as I was adjusting to it. I dismissed the sensation and focused on plans for repairs and furniture. I wanted this place to feel like mine as soon as possible. A few days later, I started receiving mail addressed to the previous owner. At first, it seemed innocent. Generic junk mail, utility notices, even a catalog or two. But then came the strange ones. Thick envelopes stamped with bold, red warnings, final notice, and urgent, action required. Curious, I opened one. The letter inside wasn't from a bank or utility company. It was handwritten. The scrawled message demanded explanations for something the writer didn't detail. It mentioned promises broken and debts unpaid. It felt personal, though I had no context to understand it. Another envelope contained a legal notice, full of vague threats about consequences if certain arrangements weren't honored. By the end of the week, I had a small stack of these unsettling messages. They all referenced the previous owner, someone I only knew by name, and none of them gave enough detail to piece together what they were about. The house felt colder at night, as if the weight of those letters had seeped into the walls. The unease was growing, so I decided to track down the previous owner. A number scrawled on an old receipt I found in the kitchen seemed like my best lead. I dialed it, expecting a simple conversation, maybe even answers about the mail or a forwarding address. But the call went straight to voicemail. A full inbox, no room for me to leave a message. I tried again the next day, and the next. Always the same result. Frustrated, I began noticing other oddities around the house. Windows I was sure I'd locked would be slightly ajar. The porch light flickered at odd intervals, even after replacing the bulb. But what unsettled me most were the people. At first, I noticed them out of the corner of my eye. Strangers pausing on the sidewalk, staring at the house as they passed. Sometimes I'd glance out the window to find someone standing directly across the street, unmoving, as if waiting. When I stepped outside to confront them, they'd already be gone. It was late one evening when the first stranger came to the door. A loud, angry knock startled me from my thoughts. I opened the door to find a man, red-faced and seething, demanding to see the previous owner. His words were sharp but vague, something about betrayal, money owed, and promises broken. "I don't know who you're looking for," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just moved in." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing as if he didn't believe me. Then, without another word, he turned and stomped off, muttering something under his breath. A few nights later, a different visitor came. This one didn't knock, but peered through the living room window. By the time I noticed, they were already gone, leaving only a smear of condensation on the glass. Each encounter chipped away at my sense of safety. The house no longer felt like a refuge. It was a stage, and I was playing a role in someone else's unfinished drama. By now, I had developed a routine. Curtains drawn at dusk, all doors and windows locked, lights on in every room. But no matter how vigilant I was, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I saw them, figures standing across the street. They didn't speak or move, they just lingered, their silhouettes illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights. At first I tried to rationalize it, neighbors being curious perhaps, but their presence wasn't casual. They stayed for hours, staring silently at the house. One night I stepped onto the porch and stared back, hoping to unsettle them. Instead, I felt like I was the one being scrutinized, measured. When I turned to go back inside, I thought I heard a faint laugh behind me, but no one was there. The nights became worse. I'd wake to the sound of faint knocking, not at the door, but along the walls, the kind of soft tapping that might be mistaken for branches in the wind. Except there were no trees near the house. Once, I heard footsteps on the roof, slow and deliberate, as if someone were pacing above me. I lay frozen in my bed until morning, too afraid to move. The house consumed my every thought. I stopped sleeping, jolting awake at the slightest sound. I began searching for answers, combing through property records and online forums. It didn't take long to uncover whispers about the house's previous owner, rumors of shady dealings, unpaid debts, and a possible connection to something criminal. But the details were scarce, and the more I learned, the less I wanted to know. The house itself seemed to resent my curiosity. Objects I was certain I'd left in one spot would appear in another. A glass shattered on its own in the kitchen. Once, while searching the attic for more clues, I thought I heard faint whispers behind me. When I turned, the attic was empty. The people outside grew bolder. One evening, I stepped out to bring in the trash bin and found a note pinned to the door. It read, "You can't hide forever." The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. It matched one of the letters I had received earlier. That night, I sat in the living room with a knife in my hand, waiting for something to happen. The house was silent, but the silence felt alive, oppressive. It happened 2 nights later. I woke to a loud crash downstairs, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. My heart pounded as I crept to the top of the stairs, gripping a heavy flashlight for protection. The living room light was on, though I knew I had turned it off before bed. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the night breeze. I stepped closer, but before I could descend, I saw it. Muddy footprints leading from the door to the hallway. They weren't mine, and they stopped abruptly at the base of the stairs. I backed away, retreating to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I stayed there until morning, too terrified to call for help or even breathe too loudly. At dawn, I finally ventured downstairs. The footprints were gone, but the door was still open. Across the street, a man stood staring at the house, his face partially obscured by a hood. When I stepped onto the porch, he turned and walked away, his movements slow and deliberate. For the first time, I realized the house wasn't mine. It never had been. I was an intruder here. I couldn't stay another day. I called a realtor that afternoon and listed the house for sale, willing to accept whatever offer came. I packed only the essentials, leaving the furniture, the curtains, and the attic full of forgotten junk behind. On my final night, I heard it again, the loud crash, this time from the attic. My first instinct was to grab my keys and leave, but some strange compulsion made me pause. For one brief moment, I considered investigating, answering whatever call the house seemed to make. Then I stopped myself. I didn't need to know. I didn't want to know. I walked out the door and didn't look back. Even as I drove away, the feeling of being watched lingered. I had always found solace in solitude. Hiking offered me an escape from the noise and weight of everyday life, a chance to clear my head. The trail I had chosen this time was one I'd heard about from friends. Isolated, beautiful, and challenging. Perfect. I arrived early in the morning, the sun barely cresting the horizon, casting a golden hue over the forested hills. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a comforting blend that reminded me why I loved being out here. As I laced up my boots, I noticed a small group of hikers gathered near the trailhead. Their faces were pale, their voices low and urgent. I wasn't one to eavesdrop, but their conversation was hard to ignore. Words like creature, danger, and unbelievable floated through the air, tinged with fear. When they saw me preparing to start the hike, one of them, a man about my age, his hands trembling slightly, approached. "Hey," he said, glancing back at his group as if seeking their approval. "You might want to think twice about this trail today. We saw something. It's not safe up there." "What did you see?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, though his unease was starting to unsettle me. "I don't know how to describe it," he replied. "It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. It was just wrong. You shouldn't go alone." I smiled politely, brushing off his warning. "I'll be fine. Probably just a bear or something," I said, adjusting my pack and stepping onto the trail. He looked like he wanted to say more, but I didn't wait. I wasn't about to let some vague story ruin my plans. As I walked, their voices faded behind me, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path. The forest seemed to welcome me with open arms, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in soft, dappled patterns. The air was cool, the trail well marked. Everything felt perfect, just as I'd hoped. The first few miles were uneventful. I fell into a steady rhythm, my mind wandering as I admired the scenery. Towering pines flanked the trail, their needles creating a soft carpet beneath my feet. Birds chirped sporadically, their melodies blending with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, something caught my eye. A tree to my left bore deep, jagged marks across its trunk. I stopped, leaning in to examine them. They weren't the usual claw marks I'd seen on other hikes, marks left by bears or even the occasional mountain lion. These were longer, deeper, and strangely irregular, almost as if whatever made them had claws that weren't evenly spaced. I traced the grooves with my fingers, feeling the splintered wood. The air seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of the forest receding into an eerie silence. A small chill crept up my spine, but I shook it off. "Probably just an old bear," I muttered under my breath, though the explanation didn't quite fit. As I continued, I began to notice more of these marks, scattered along the trail. Some were higher up on the trees, others low to the ground, as though the creature had been moving erratically. My unease grew, but I pushed it aside. Animals did strange things sometimes. There was no reason to jump to conclusions. About an hour later, I reached a clearing where the trail widened and the ground became softer, damp from recent rain. That's when I saw them, footprints. At first, I thought they were human, but as I crouched to get a better look, the details didn't add up. The prints were large, much larger than my own, and the shape was odd. The toes were elongated, splayed out unnaturally, with what looked like claw imprints at the tips. And there was something else, a dragging line that trailed behind each step, as though whatever had made these prints moved with a strange, uneven gait. I followed the tracks with my eyes, noticing how they veered off the trail and into the denser part of the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper there, darker, as if they were concealing something. My stomach nodded, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a bear with an injured paw, I reasoned, though the thought didn't sit right. I stood there for a long moment, debating whether to follow the tracks or stick to the trail. The latter won out. I wasn't here to play detective. I just wanted to finish the hike and enjoy my day. The forest grew quieter the farther I went. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an unsettling stillness, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. I felt a prickle of unease, but forced myself to focus on the path ahead. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, faint at first but unmistakable. It wasn't a growl, not quite, but something deeper, more primal. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, closer this time, and my heart began to race. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, and then I saw it. A figure moving between the trunks, too far to make out clearly, but close enough to see that it wasn't human. Its shape was wrong, hunched and elongated, its movements unnervingly smooth yet somehow jerky. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, a deer or a large bird. But deep down, I knew better. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The figure paused, its head, or what I assumed was its head, tilting in my direction. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. My legs finally obeyed, and I started walking. Faster this time, my breath coming in short bursts. Behind me, the forest seemed to shift, the shadows growing thicker. I kept my pace steady, refusing to break into a run despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to flee. The logical part of my brain clung to reason. Maybe it was just an animal, but deep down I knew. The thing I had glimpsed wasn't like anything I'd seen before. Then I heard it again, a heavy thud followed by a dragging noise. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from behind me. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath, my ears straining to pick up the sound. The forest was deathly silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. For a moment I thought I might have imagined it, but then the sound came again, louder this time, and unmistakably closer. It wasn't just following me, it was pursuing me. My feet finally gave in to panic, and I broke into a run. The weight of my pack slowed me down, but adrenaline surged through my veins, pushing me forward. The sound of my footsteps on the trail mixed with the guttural noises coming from the creature, growing louder, more guttural, like some deep, animalistic panting. The thing wasn't just running, it was bounding, covering ground impossibly fast. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creature was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was coming straight for me. The shape was humanoid but grotesquely elongated. Its arms were too long, almost brushing the ground as it moved. Its legs bent at unnatural angles, propelling it forward with terrifying speed. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I forced myself to keep running, the trail blurring beneath my feet. The forest seemed to conspire against me as I ran. The trail twisted and turned, narrowing in places and forcing me to slow down. Branches reached out like claws, scratching my face and arms, while roots threatened to trip me at every step. Behind me, the creature's pursuit was relentless. Its guttural sounds filled the air, mingling with the crash of its heavy footfalls. It was close, too close. I could feel its presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. I stumbled once, nearly falling, and the sound of the creature's growl grew louder. I scrambled back to my feet, the panic now overriding any thought of pain or exhaustion. The trail ahead became harder to see as the light dimmed. Shadows closed in, turning the forest into a maze of indistinguishable shapes. I took a sharp turn, veering off the trail in desperation, hoping to lose it in the denser woods. The terrain was uneven, the ground soft and slick with moss. I could barely see where I was going, but I didn't dare stop. The creature didn't seem to have the same problem. It moved with unnatural ease, its guttural noises now accompanied by the snapping of branches and the crunch of undergrowth. The sound was maddening, a constant reminder of how close it was. Suddenly, the forest opened up into a small clearing. In the center was an old, gnarled tree, its twisted roots forming a tangled web. I darted around it, hoping to use it as a barrier, but the creature didn't slow. It seemed to thrive in the chaos, its distorted figure moving with terrifying precision. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. The thought of what would happen if it caught me was too horrifying to consider. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw it, a faint glow through the trees, the trailhead. Relief surged through me, giving me one final burst of energy. I pushed forward, my vision tunneling as I focused on that tiny beacon of safety. The creature's sounds were still close, but they seemed to falter as I approached the edge of the forest. I risked another glance over my shoulder and saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, its grotesque form half hidden in the shadows. It didn't follow me any further. For a moment I thought it might retreat, but then it crouched low, its elongated arms reaching out toward the ground. It let out a guttural, almost mournful sound before disappearing into the trees. I stumbled out of the woods, collapsing onto the dirt path at the trailhead. My chest heaved, every muscle in my body trembling. The world outside the forest felt surreal, almost too bright and normal compared to the nightmare I had just escaped. The gym had always been my sanctuary. After long days at work, the rhythmic clanking of weights and the steady hum of treadmills provided a strange kind of solace. My schedule was predictable. Arrive at 6:30 p.m., warm up for 10 minutes, and then move through my usual routine: bench press, squats, pull-ups. It was comforting in its monotony, a way to clear my mind and focus on myself. I first noticed him about 2 weeks ago. At first, it was subtle, just another face in the gym crowd. He was always nearby, though, choosing machines adjacent to mine, lingering longer than necessary. It didn't seem strange at first. Gyms weren't private spaces. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time I moved to a new area, he wasn't far behind. If I went to the free weights, he'd settle at the bench press nearby. When I stretched in the corner, he'd use the mats a few feet away. I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking directly at him. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe he just had a similar routine. But even then, the thought nagged at me. Why did he always seem to be watching? Over the next few visits, his presence grew harder to ignore. He wasn't just using nearby equipment anymore. He was watching. Always watching. His gaze wasn't casual or distracted like most gym-goers. It was fixed, intense, and unrelenting. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was being paranoid. But then I started noticing him outside the gym as well. One night, as I left the building, I caught a glimpse of him in the parking lot. He wasn't walking to his car or talking to anyone. He was just standing there, his posture rigid, his face half hidden in the shadows. My heart raced as I hurried to my own car, fumbling with the keys, feeling his presence even as I drove away. The next time, he followed me for nearly a block before veering off into an alley. I didn't know whether to confront him or call the police. Was I overreacting? He hadn't done anything threatening, yet. But his constant presence gnawed at my nerves, turning every moment at the gym into an exercise in vigilance. And then, one day, he wasn't there. I should have felt relieved, but his absence only made my anxiety worse. I kept glancing around the gym, expecting him to appear at any moment. But the minutes stretched on, and he didn't show. I finished my workout with an uneasy sense of anticipation, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. When I left the gym that evening, the parking lot seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination get the better of me. Still, as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the hum of a distant car, set my nerves on edge. I deliberately took a longer route, avoiding the usual shortcuts, hoping to shake the irrational sense of unease. The alley came into view as I rounded the corner. It was a narrow, dimly lit stretch I'd passed 100 times before, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the silence was suffocating. As I neared the alley, a hand shot out, gripping my arm with a force that made me stumble. My breath hitched as I turned to see him, the man from the gym. Up close, his face was even more unnerving. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. I tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. My voice caught in my throat for a moment before I screamed, the sound raw and piercing. It echoed off the alley walls, shattering the heavy silence. A passerby appeared at the mouth of the alley, their voice cutting through the chaos. "Hey, what's going on?" The man released me abruptly, his head snapping toward the newcomer. Without a word, he turned and bolted into the darkness, his footsteps fading as quickly as they had appeared. I stood frozen, my arm throbbing where he had grabbed me, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the concerned stranger asking if I was okay. After the encounter in the alley, I knew I couldn't just brush this off anymore. My hands trembled as I called the police, trying to piece together the events of the night into a coherent report. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high, too shaky, but I managed to explain what had happened. The officer on the other end asked me to describe the man. I stammered through a description, mid-30s, average height, dark hair, wiry build. It felt like a weak summary, but when I thought about it, I realized I hadn't truly studied his face. All I could remember was his stare, those wide, unblinking eyes that had followed me at the gym, in the parking lot, and finally in that alley. They sent someone to meet me, and I repeated my story, this time in more detail. The officer nodded, scribbling notes in a small notebook, but I could tell by the faint crease in his brow that he wasn't hopeful. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, handing me a card with his contact information. "But these things can be tricky. If he shows up again, don't hesitate to call." As I walked back to my apartment that night, the world felt smaller, darker. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every pedestrian felt like a potential threat. I double-locked my door when I got home, something I hadn't done in years. The days that followed were tense. I avoided the gym entirely, not wanting to risk another encounter with the man. My routine, once a source of comfort, now felt like a liability. Everywhere I went, I found myself scanning the crowd for his face, jumping at every unfamiliar figure. Even at home, the fear followed me. The faint creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, ordinary sounds took on a sinister quality. At night, I would lie awake, listening for footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, my heart racing at every imagined noise. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the man was gone. He had been scared off by the stranger in the alley. But the memory of his grip, the intensity of his stare, refused to fade. What had he wanted from me? Why had he been watching me for weeks? These questions gnawed at me, their answers just out of reach. I reported his description to the gym as well, hoping they might have some information on him. The manager promised to review security footage and alert their staff, but when I followed up a few days later, they had nothing concrete to share. "He hasn't been back," they told me, as if that was supposed to be comforting. Weeks passed, and life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. I started going back to the gym, though not without hesitation. My first visit back was tense. I spent more time scanning the room than working out, my pulse quickening every time a new person entered. But as the days went by, my anxiety began to ease. The man was nowhere to be seen. I adjusted my routine slightly, going at different times and taking alternate routes home, just in case. The changes felt inconvenient but necessary, a small price to pay for peace of mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even when I was alone, the memory of his gaze lingered, like a phantom presence just out of sight. I told myself it was just paranoia, a natural response to what I'd been through. But the doubt remained, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. One night, as I was locking up my apartment, I hesitated. The hallway outside was silent, the dim glow of the overhead light casting long shadows on the walls. I stood there for a moment, staring at the peephole, half expecting to see his distorted silhouette on the other side. Nothing. Just the empty hallway. I turned the lock and stepped back, letting the familiar weight of the door click into place. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. It was an unremarkable weekday afternoon, and I had settled into my usual routine at home. The quiet hum of the neighborhood filled the air, birds chirping, the distant sound of a lawnmower, and the occasional car passing by. I was in the middle of sorting some papers at the kitchen table when the knock came. It wasn't hurried or aggressive, just firm and deliberate. Curious, I went to the door. Standing there was a man dressed in a uniform that resembled those worn by utility workers. He held a clipboard in one hand and wore a tool belt that seemed well used but slightly disorganized. "Good afternoon," he said with a polite smile. "I'm with the utility company. We're doing some maintenance work in the area, and I need to access your property to check the meter." I hesitated for a moment. I hadn't been notified of any scheduled maintenance, but the man's appearance seemed legitimate enough. His demeanor was professional, if a little stiff. I nodded and stepped aside to let him through. "Sure, it's in the backyard. Just follow the path on the left." He thanked me and walked past, clipboard in hand. I returned to my papers but kept an ear out, vaguely aware of his movements. At first, everything seemed normal, the occasional clink of tools, the rustle of leaves, but something about the situation felt slightly off. Minutes passed, and I realized I hadn't heard much activity. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the man near the meter, but he was lingering near the garage instead. His posture was odd, half turned toward the house as if he were looking inside. I frowned, my unease growing. Why was he there? The meter was on the far side of the yard, nowhere near the garage. Deciding to keep an eye on him, I stepped into the living room, which gave me a better view. He wasn't just lingering, he was staring. His gaze shifted between the house and the street, his expression unreadable. Then he moved closer to the windows, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he were surveying the property. I opened the back door and called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything okay out there?" He flinched at the sound, quickly turning toward me. "Oh yes, just taking a look around," he said, waving his clipboard awkwardly. "Need to make sure there aren't any obstructions for the maintenance work." His explanation didn't sit right. There were no obstructions anywhere near the meter, and his tone was strained, almost too cheerful. I nodded curtly and closed the door, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. My unease continued to grow. The man had been on my property for far longer than seemed necessary, and his movements didn't match the tasks he claimed to be performing. I decided to take action. Grabbing my phone, I searched for the utility company's website. It didn't take long to find their customer service number, and I called, explaining the situation to the representative. "Can you tell me the name of the employee?" the woman on the other end asked. I stepped outside and called to the man, asking for his name. He hesitated for a moment before replying, giving me a name that sounded generic enough to be believable. I relayed it to the representative. After a brief pause, her tone shifted. "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that name employed with us, and we're not conducting maintenance in your area today." My heart sank. I thanked her and hung up, gripping my phone tightly. My suspicions were confirmed. This man wasn't who he claimed to be. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. My hands were trembling slightly as I stepped outside, determined to confront him. He was now near the side of the house, his back turned to me. "Excuse me," I said, louder than I intended. He turned, startled, his eyes darting between me and the street. "I just spoke with the utility company," I continued, keeping my voice firm. "They don't have any record of you or any scheduled work here. I need you to leave my property immediately." For a moment, he didn't respond. His expression flickered between confusion and something darker, frustration, maybe even anger. But then he forced a smile and raised his hands as if to placate me. "Must be a misunderstanding," he said, taking a step back. "I'll check with my supervisor and come back another day." "No," I said firmly. "Don't come back." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly before he turned and walked toward the street. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner, my heart pounding in my chest. As soon as he was gone, I locked every door and window in the house. The sense of safety I once felt in my home, now a distant memory. That night, the house felt different, quieter, darker, as though the air itself carried the weight of unease. I tried to shake off the paranoia, telling myself the man was gone for good. Still, I double-checked the locks on every door and window before heading to bed, leaving a light on in the hallway for reassurance. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night, unsure of what had stirred me. The room was silent, but there was an electric tension in the air that made my skin prickle. I stayed still, listening. A faint noise reached my ears, a soft scraping sound, as if something was brushing against the side of the house. My breath hitched. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the window, keeping my movements quiet. Pulling the curtain aside just a fraction, I peered into the darkness outside. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow shifted near the edge of the yard. It was him. The faint glow of the streetlight caught his profile as he lingered just beyond the reach of the porch lights. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the window. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling over the screen as I dialed the non-emergency police number. I explained the situation as quietly as I could, my voice barely above a whisper. "Stay inside and keep your doors locked," the dispatcher instructed. "An officer will be there shortly." After hanging up, I felt a surge of determination. I wasn't going to let this man intimidate me or invade my space. Moving through the house, I turned on every exterior light, flooding the yard with illumination. The sudden brightness startled him. He stepped further into the shadows, but I could still see the faint outline of his figure. I gathered a few items for protection. Nothing fancy, just a heavy flashlight and a broom handle I found in the closet. It wasn't much, but it made me feel slightly less vulnerable. I returned to the window, carefully keeping myself out of view. The man hadn't left. Instead, he seemed to be pacing along the edge of the property, his movements slow and deliberate. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Every sound, the creak of the house, the rustle of the wind, felt amplified, feeding my already heightened anxiety. I clutched the flashlight tightly, my eyes fixed on the yard, ready for any sign of movement toward the house. When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights cut through the darkness like a lifeline. The man bolted at the first sight of them, disappearing into the shadows before I could even point him out. I stepped outside as the officers approached, explaining everything that had happened, his visit earlier that day, his suspicious behavior, and his return during the night. They listened carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions about his appearance and actions. "He's likely testing boundaries," one of them said, "seeing how far he can push before someone reacts. You did the right thing by calling us." They promised to patrol the area more frequently and advised me to keep my house well lit and secure. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for. The man was still out there somewhere, but their presence brought a small measure of comfort. Before leaving, one of the officers handed me his card. "Call us immediately if you see him again," he said firmly. "Don't engage with him directly." The days that followed felt like living under a microscope. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window sent my heart racing. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every time I stepped outside, scanning the street for any sign of the man. He never returned, but the sense of unease he left behind lingered. It started with a sleek envelope that arrived in my mailbox one ordinary afternoon. The paper was thick and embossed, the kind of stationery used for important, high-profile events. My name was written in elegant cursive, and inside was an invitation. "You are cordially invited to an exclusive private event. Unparalleled opportunities await. Date, this Saturday, 8 p.m. Venue, the Glasswood Hall." The details were vague, but the language was tantalizing. Unparalleled opportunities? I wondered if it was a networking event or some kind of private business gathering. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Who would invite me to something like this? But there was no RSVP number or contact information to confirm or decline. It simply said to bring the invitation for entry. The curiosity gnawed at me all week. By the time Saturday rolled around, I'd convinced myself there was no harm in attending. If it turned out to be a scam or a gimmick, I could always leave. The Glasswood Hall was tucked away on the edge of the city, its reflective exterior gleaming under the dim evening light. A small, understated sign on the door confirmed I was in the right place. I stepped inside, invitation in hand, and was immediately greeted by two attendants dressed in sharp black suits. Without a word, one of them scanned my invitation and nodded, motioning for me to enter. The hall was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from a vaulted ceiling, casting soft, golden light over the room. The polished marble floor gleamed, reflecting the light in a way that made the space seem endless. Dozens of people mingled in small groups, their murmurs creating a low hum that filled the air. I felt underdressed in my business casual outfit, but no one seemed to notice. The attendees were an odd mix. Some were dressed in formal evening wear, others in casual attire like mine. Despite the differences, they all shared one peculiar trait. Their expressions were eerily composed, their smiles perfectly measured. As I walked deeper into the hall, a waiter appeared, offering me a drink on a silver tray. I declined, feeling a growing unease. Something about the atmosphere was too perfect, too orchestrated. I tried to engage in conversation with a few of the attendees, but their responses were short and vague. It was as though they were there, physically, but not mentally present. One man, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, simply smiled at me without saying a word before drifting away. By the time the clock struck 9 p.m., my unease had grown into a gnawing sense of dread. Whatever I had expected this event to be, it wasn't that. I decided it was time to leave. I made my way to the large double doors at the far end of the hall, the same ones I had entered through. To my surprise, they didn't budge. I pulled harder, but they wouldn't move, as though they were locked. I glanced around, hoping to find one of the attendants, but they were nowhere to be seen. My pulse quickened as I moved to a side door near the restrooms. It too was locked. The other guests seemed oblivious to my growing panic, continuing their quiet conversations as if nothing was wrong. I approached one of them, a woman in a flowing red gown, and asked if she knew how to exit. She turned to me slowly, her smile still plastered on her face. "The event isn't over yet," she said in a flat, detached tone, then walked away. My heart raced as I realized I was trapped. The air in the room seemed heavier now, pressing down on me. I moved toward a corner, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when the lights dimmed and a figure stepped out from the shadows. The man was tall and impeccably dressed, his black suit fitting him like a second skin. His face was pale, his features sharp and angular, and his eyes seemed to bore into me with an intensity that made me freeze in place. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "I've been waiting for you." "How do you know me?" I asked, my voice shaky. He smiled faintly. "That's not important. What matters is the opportunity before you. I'm here to offer you something extraordinary. Wealth, power, influence, whatever your heart desires. All I ask in return is a simple agreement." He produced a small black ledger from his coat pocket and opened it, revealing a blank page. A sleek pen appeared in his hand as though by magic. "I need your signature," he said, holding the pen out to me. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to refuse. "What kind of agreement?" I asked, stalling for time. "Details aren't important," he replied, his smile widening. "You sign, and everything you've ever wanted becomes yours." I took a step back, shaking my head. "I'm not signing anything." The man's expression didn't falter, but there was a glint of annoyance in his eyes. "Are you certain?" "Yes," I said firmly, my voice steadier now. He studied me for a moment before snapping the ledger shut. "Very well, but you'll find leaving here won't be so simple." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. The room felt colder, emptier. I was alone again, but the doors remained locked. The silence in the hall was deafening after the man disappeared. My legs felt rooted to the spot, but my mind was racing. I had to get out. Whatever this was, whatever he was, it wasn't normal. I hurried back to the main doors, pulling on the handles with all my strength, but they didn't give. I turned my attention to the windows. They stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with heavy curtains that had seemed decorative when I arrived. Now, they felt like barriers, adding to the suffocating sense of enclosure. Peering through the glass, I could see the dark outline of the cityscape beyond, but there was no way to open them. They were sealed tight, their panes cold and unyielding under my hands. Panic bubbled up in my chest, and I began shouting, "Help! Is anyone there? Please, I'm locked in here!" My voice echoed through the cavernous space, but there was no response. The other guests, if they had even been real, were gone. I screamed louder, pounding on the doors and windows until my fists ached. For a moment, I thought I saw movement outside, a shadow passing by. Fueled by hope, I yelled again, louder this time. "Help! I'm trapped in here!" Seconds stretched into minutes, and then I heard it. A faint voice outside, muffled but unmistakable. Someone had heard me. Relief washed over me, though it was quickly tempered by fear. What if the man returned before help arrived? It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes before I heard the sound of distant sirens. I pressed my face to the window, straining to see, and spotted the flashing red and blue lights of a police car pulling up to the building. I pounded on the glass, shouting to get their attention. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They scanned the area, and I watched as their beams landed on the doors. One of them approached, testing the handles, while the other circled the building. "It's locked from the outside," I shouted, though I doubted they could hear me through the thick glass. Moments later, I heard the sound of something metal being forced. With a loud clunk, the doors finally gave way, swinging open as the officers stepped inside. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, his voice calm but concerned. I stumbled forward, my legs shaky as I nodded. "I'm fine, but something's wrong. There was a man here, and he locked me in. He wanted me to sign something, and when I refused, I trailed off, struggling to put the bizarre events into words. The officers exchanged a glance. "We'll need to take a statement," one of them said, "but let's check the premises first." They moved through the hall, their flashlights illuminating the dark corners. But there was nothing. No sign of the man, the other attendees, or even the supposed event staff who had greeted me earlier. The space was empty, eerily pristine, as though no one had been there at all. I sat on the steps outside the building, wrapped in a thin blanket one of the officers had given me. My hands trembled as I held a cup of water, replaying the night's events in my mind. The police asked me detailed questions, jotting down notes as I described everything: the invitation, the hall, the strange man and his proposal. But with no evidence or witnesses, they seemed skeptical. "There's no record of any event being scheduled here tonight," one of them said. "The building's owner says it's been closed for renovations for months." "That's not possible," I said, my voice rising. "I was here. There were people, guests, staff. That man." "We believe you," the officer said carefully, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But without any physical evidence, there's not much we can do. We'll file a report and keep the case open, just in case." I nodded numbly, knowing there was no point in arguing. As they drove me home, the city's familiar streets felt surreal, as if I had crossed into another world and was now struggling to return. It was well past midnight when I finally pulled into my driveway, the soft hum of my car engine the only sound breaking the quiet. The street was nearly deserted, the occasional flicker of a street lamp casting faint halos of light onto the pavement. My day had dragged on longer than expected, and all I wanted was to lock the door behind me and collapse into bed. As I turned off the engine, I noticed something odd: a figure standing near the corner of my garage, half hidden in the shadows. For a moment, I thought my tired mind was playing tricks on me. The figure was motionless, its shape vague in the dim light, but unmistakably human. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was just a neighbor passing through, someone taking a shortcut. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't moving, and something about its stillness felt unnatural, deliberate. My pulse quickened. I debated staying in the car, locking the doors, and calling someone. But then I thought of how ridiculous I'd feel if it turned out to be nothing. A shadow, a trick of the light. Summoning my courage, I stepped out of the car, keys in hand, and took a cautious step toward the garage. The crunch of gravel underfoot seemed impossibly loud as I moved closer. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the figure, half expecting it to be gone already. But it wasn't. It was still there, standing unnervingly still, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I opened my mouth to say something, maybe to ask who they were or to tell them to leave. But before I could, the figure moved. Not toward me, not away, but sideways, slipping into the darkness with an unsettling fluidity. It was as if they'd been waiting for me to notice before retreating. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the side yard that led to the backyard and the woods beyond. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound firm. There was no answer, only the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. A cold knot of unease settled in my stomach. I told myself it could have been anyone, a curious stranger, maybe a lost pedestrian. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I glanced toward the garage, then toward the house. For the first time, my home didn't feel safe. I forced myself to walk toward the garage, the keyring in my hand now clenched tightly like a makeshift weapon. The air felt heavier somehow, as though the night itself was holding its breath. As I approached the garage door, I noticed something unusual. In the faint light from the street lamp, I could make out a set of footprints in the thin layer of dirt near the base of the door. They were fresh, too large to be mine, and led directly toward the spot where the figure had been standing. Kneeling to get a closer look, I noticed something else. A faint smell lingering in the air. It was sharp and acrid like cigarette smoke, but with an almost metallic edge. It clung to the space around me, distinct yet unplaceable. My eyes scanned the ground for more clues, and I saw it. A wrench lying near the corner of the garage, slightly out of place. It was mine, but I hadn't used it in months, and it certainly hadn't been lying there when I'd left earlier that day. A fresh wave of unease washed over me as I straightened up, my gaze darting toward the darkened side yard where the figure had vanished. My instincts screamed at me to go inside, to lock the door and call someone, anyone. I retreated to the house, my steps quick but measured, trying not to let my fear get the better of me. My hands shook as I unlocked the front door, stepping inside and immediately bolting it behind me. The house was dark and silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every small sound. I turned on every light as I moved through the rooms, checking each window and door to make sure they were locked. My heart pounded in my chest, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. The kitchen window was slightly ajar, something I hadn't noticed earlier. I locked it quickly, my breath catching as I thought of how easily someone could have slipped inside. I grabbed my phone and hovered over the call button for the police, but hesitated. What would I tell them? That I saw a shadowy figure and found some footprints? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the front door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The night stretched on, every tick of the clock echoing in the quiet house. I didn't sleep that night, my ears straining for the faintest sound of movement outside. The hours dragged on, the quiet of the house broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant howl of the wind. I sat by the window, the curtains pulled just enough to give me a sliver of a view of the driveway. The streetlight outside cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the pavement, and every movement sent my heart racing. I hadn't seen the figure again, but the memory of its sudden disappearance lingered like a dark cloud. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Who had they been? What had they wanted? And why had they left behind such subtle but deliberate evidence of their presence? At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft, deliberate, crunching against the gravel near the garage. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound lasted only a few seconds before fading into silence. Gripping my phone, I debated calling the police again. But what would I say? The intruder wasn't actively threatening me, and there was no sign they were still around. The fear of being dismissed kept me from dialing. Instead, I stayed awake, alternating between staring out the window and pacing the house, checking the locks for the 100th time. The unease was suffocating, a relentless weight pressing down on me. When the first light of dawn finally crept over the horizon, I felt a small wave of relief. The soft, golden glow dispelled some of the night's oppressive darkness, but the unease didn't completely fade. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the yard and driveway in the pale morning light. The footprints were still there, their patterns clearer now against the dirt. They led from the garage to the side yard, where they disappeared into the grass. The misplaced wrench was still lying near the garage corner, its metallic surface gleaming faintly. I bent to pick it up, the cool metal sending a shiver through me. The faint scent of smoke still lingered in the air, but weaker now, as if the night had tried to erase the traces of the intruder. As I examined the area further, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before, a faint scratch on the garage door, as though someone had run a sharp object along its surface. It wasn't deep, but it was deliberate, like a subtle mark left behind to signal their presence. I took photos of everything, the footprints, the scratch, the wrench, unsure of what to do with them, but feeling a need to document the evidence. Later that morning, I called the police. The officer who answered listened patiently as I described the events of the night. Though I could sense their skepticism, they promised to send someone to take a report. When the officer arrived, I showed them the photos and walked them through what had happened. They examined the footprints and the scratch on the garage, but admitted there wasn't much they could do without more concrete evidence or a direct threat. It could have been a trespasser or a would-be burglar, the officer said. Sometimes they scout properties to see if they're easy targets. I'd recommend installing some security cameras and keeping your doors and windows locked. Their words did little to ease my anxiety. I thanked them and promised to follow their advice, but the thought of someone deliberately scouting my home left me on edge. Over the next few days, I made several changes. I installed motion sensor lights around the property, added deadbolts to the doors, and purchased a basic security camera to monitor the driveway and garage. Each step brought a small sense of control, but the fear lingered.